There's a particular kind of question that hangs over a monarchy whenever its king starts to look a little more tired than usual in public, a question nobody in the royal household will ever answer directly, but one that everyone, courtiers, journalists, and ordinary people watching the news, finds themselves quietly asking anyway. How much longer? Not in a morbid sense, not necessarily, but in the practical sense of an institution that has to plan generations ahead while pretending, in public, that everything is simply continuing as it always has. King Charles III is now in his 4th year on the throne, the oldest person in British history to ever take the crown, and the questions swirling around his future have shifted, almost imperceptibly but unmistakably, from questions about how he would reign to questions about how long he will and what exactly comes next. It quote S worth remembering just how unusual Charles's path to the throne already was before any of this health drama began. He spent more than 70 years as heir apparent, the longest wait in the history of the British monarchy, finally becoming king at 73, following his mother's death in September of 2022. He inherited not just a crown, but an institution that had spent decades being shaped almost entirely around his mother's particular brand of quiet, steady, famously tight-lipped style of leadership. Charles, by contrast, arrived with decades of public opinions already on record about architecture, about the environment, about alternative medicine, about modern farming. Opinions a king is technically supposed to set aside the moment he takes the throne. The early questions about his reign were about whether he could actually do that, whether decades of being an outspoken prince could really be folded neatly into the famously neutral, voiceless role of constitutional monarch. For the most part, by most accounts, he managed it. But just as that question started to settle, a different, far more serious one took its place. In February of 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that the king had undergone a procedure for a benign enlarged prostate, and that follow-up tests during that treatment had revealed a separate, unrelated form of cancer. The palace, true to long-standing royal tradition around medical privacy, never disclosed exactly what type of cancer it was or how advanced it had been at diagnosis, only that it had been caught early and that the king would continue with a reduced public schedule while undergoing treatment. That announcement marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter in how the public would be allowed to watch their monarch age in real time, a far more transparent chapter than almost any previous reign, and also a far more uncertain one. For the better part of 2 years, the rhythm of Charles's public life has been defined by that diagnosis. There have been hospital visits, carefully framed video messages, public appearances scaled back and then cautiously expanded again as his doctors apparently judged his progress. By the end of 2025, the king was delivering an unusually personal video message about his own experience with cancer, thanking medical staff and urging the public to take screening seriously, describing the value of early detection in language clearly drawn from his own diagnosis. He announced, heading into the new year, that his treatment schedule would be reduced in 2026, a development the palace framed as a genuinely hopeful milestone, evidence that early intervention had worked roughly as well as anyone could have hoped. Even that positive framing came with its own complications. Royal commentators reported that behind the reassuring public messaging, the king had actually been undergoing a notably aggressive and expensive course of treatment, combining immunotherapy with newer experimental RNA-based drugs, the kind of cutting-edge oncology usually associated with major teaching hospitals and significant private resources. None of this was confirmed in granular detail by the palace itself, which has maintained its traditional discretion about the precise nature of his illness throughout. But the broader reporting suggested a monarch whose medical team had pursued every available advantage, and whose underlying prognosis remained even with apparent improvement, something senior royal watchers were still parsing carefully for any hint of what might come next. That uncertainty is exactly what fuels the steady drumbeat of abdication speculation that has followed Charles for much of this year. Reports circulated, particularly after a state banquet in March honoring Nigeria's visiting president, describing a king who appeared visibly fatigued, standing alongside a notably more energetic Prince and Princess of Wales, prompting a wave of tabloid stories suggesting Charles might step aside shortly after his official birthday celebrations in June, supposedly to hand the monarchy over to William, while it could still be framed as a deliberate, dignified exit rather than a forced one. Royal insiders quoted anonymously in several outlets suggested the king wanted to, as one source put it, go out on a high, with William said to be increasingly active behind the scenes, hosting investitures, greeting visiting heads of state, and taking on more of the ceremonial workload his father has had to scale back. Buckingham Palace, for its part, has never confirmed any of this, and the king has repeatedly signaled through his actions that he intends to keep reigning rather than step aside. When Trooping the Color, his official birthday parade, finally arrived in mid-June, Charles appeared at the ceremony as the reigning monarch, presenting new colors to the Grenadier Guards and taking the royal salute exactly as tradition demands, a fairly clear signal, at least for now, that the abdication rumors swirling for months hadn't translated into any actual change of plans. Royal historians have long pointed out that abdication carries a particularly loaded history within this specific family, tracing back to the king's own great-uncle, Edward VIII, whose abdication in 1936 is still remembered within royal circles as a genuine constitutional trauma rather than a simple, dignified handover. For a king who has waited over 7 decades for this job, walking away voluntarily, even for understandable health reasons, would be an extraordinarily difficult symbolic step, one most observers still doubt he's eager to take unless his health genuinely forces the issue. What does seem clear, regardless of whether Charles ever formally steps aside, is that the practical machinery of monarchy is already quietly shifting weight onto William's shoulders. As Duke of Cornwall, William now manages a private estate worth well over £1 billion, generating tens of millions in annual income, and reports earlier this year noted he personally pays several £1 million annually in income tax on that income, the kind of detail that matters enormously to a public increasingly sensitive about royal finances and transparency. Beyond the money, William has begun taking on responsibilities that were traditionally reserved exclusively for the reigning monarch, including being granted the authority, alongside Kate, to issue royal warrants, the official endorsements companies receive for supplying goods and services to the royal household. Constitutional commentators have described this as an unusually early extension of monarchical authority to an heir who technically remains a prince, a quiet but meaningful signal that the institution is preparing for transition well before any formal handover actually happens. Kate, quote, S. own health journey adds another layer to this picture of a royal family cautiously testing how much public weight its younger generation can now carry. After her own cancer diagnosis and treatment, which became public in early 2024, around the same period as her father-in-law's announcement, the Princess of Wales spent much of the following 2 years gradually rebuilding her public schedule, confirming her remission roughly a year ago, and slowly increasing both the frequency and visibility of her engagement since. Her appearances alongside William at major state occasions, including that same March banquet that triggered so much speculation about Charles's stamina, have increasingly been read by royal watchers less as routine royal business and more as a kind of unofficial audition Two generations of the family being placed side by side in the public eye, inviting an obvious, unspoken comparison between an aging, ailing monarch and a visibly more youthful couple waiting in the wings. If health were the only complication facing Charles's future, the picture would already be complicated enough. But this year has also forced the institution to confront a crisis involving the king's own younger brother that has in some ways posed a more existential threat to the monarchy's reputation than anything related to age or illness. Andrew, once Duke of York, had already spent years on the margins of royal life following intense scrutiny over his association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. In October of last year, the king initiated a formal process to strip his brother of his remaining style, titles, and honors, and by early November, Andrew had officially lost the right to use Prince, His Royal Highness, and the Duke of York title altogether, becoming, in the eyes of official royal documentation, simply Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. That alone might have closed the chapter, at least administratively. But matters escalated sharply in February of this year when Andrew was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office, an event that triggered immediate serious conversations at the highest levels of government about whether he should be removed entirely from the line of succession, a step so rare in modern British history that the only real precedent dates back to his own great-uncle's abdication. Government ministers confirmed they were working directly with Buckingham Palace on the question, and leaders across several Commonwealth realms, including Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, publicly signaled their support for stripping him of any future claim to the throne, however distant that claim already was. Legal experts have cautioned that the actual process would be slow and complicated, requiring legislation to pass not just through the UK Parliament, but through the parliaments of every Commonwealth nation where the king remains head of state, a process some have compared to the lengthy multi-year effort it took just to modernize ordinary succession rules over a decade ago. For Charles personally, this entire situation lands with a particularly uncomfortable weight. Whatever his private feelings about his brother, and reports throughout this saga have repeatedly suggested years of strained, even openly hostile relations between the two men, the king has had to manage this crisis as a head of state navigating one of the most damaging scandals to touch the monarchy in living memory, while simultaneously being the brother who ultimately had to authorize stripping his own sibling of nearly everything that once defined his public identity. Some reporting has gone further, describing intelligence assessments suggesting Andrew had been deliberately targeted and cultivated as a vulnerability by foreign intelligence services precisely because of his access and his complicated personal history, allegations Andrew has not directly addressed and which remain unproven, but which nonetheless deepen the sense that this entire chapter represents far more than an embarrassing family scandal. It is by any reasonable measure a genuine national security and constitutional question landing squarely on Charles's desk at the exact moment his own health has already narrowed how much energy he has left to manage it. Then there's Harry, a different kind of open wound, less explosive than the Andrew situation, but more persistent, more emotionally complicated, and seemingly no closer to resolution despite years of speculation about reconciliation. Since stepping back from royal duties in 2020, Harry has pursued an unusually public, unusually litigious path, taking on the British tabloid press directly through multiple lawsuits over alleged phone hacking and unlawful information gathering, becoming, along the way, the first senior royal in well over a century to testify from the witness stand in a British courtroom. He has separately fought, and largely lost, a years-long legal battle over the loss of his automatic government-funded security detail when visiting the UK, with courts repeatedly ruling that the relevant security committee acted within its rights to assess his protection on a case-by-case basis rather than restoring the standing protection he once had as a working royal. That fight appeared to take a meaningful turn earlier this year when the committee responsible for VIP security launched a fresh review of Harry's risk assessment, with reporting suggesting officials were now more sympathetic to reversing course, partly due to procedural gaps identified in how his earlier assessment had been handled. Whether that review ultimately restores meaningful protection remains, as of now, still an open question, but the stakes extend well beyond Harry's own personal safety. Multiple reports have suggested that any resumption of proper security arrangements could finally open the door to more frequent visits to Britain, potentially including bringing his children to meet their grandfather for the first time since they were infants. A detail that adds genuine emotional weight to what might otherwise read as a purely legal and administrative dispute. What makes the Harry situation particularly difficult for Charles's future is the reported split in how father and son approach the broader question of reconciliation. Various accounts from people close to the family have suggested the king remains personally inclined towards some kind of rapprochement with his younger son, perhaps driven by the simple, very human awareness that his own time and energy are not unlimited, while William is described as considerably less willing to extend the same openness, said to harbor deeper, more entrenched frustration over how the Sussexes have spoken publicly about the family over the past several years. That generational and personal divide matters enormously for what the monarchy will look like once Charles is no longer the one making these decisions, since William's evident reluctance suggests any current thaw in relations might prove temporary, contingent entirely on a father whose own continued presence on the throne is itself now an open question. Step back from any single storyline, the cancer, the abdication rumors, Andrew, Harry, and a broader pattern becomes visible, one that probably worries long-term observers of the institution more than any single scandal. The working royal family has been shrinking for years, a deliberate slimming down meant to project modesty and value for taxpayer money, but one that now leaves remarkably few people available to actually carry out the volume of public duties a modern monarchy requires. Several senior royals still actively working are well into their 70s or beyond, meaning the practical weight of representing the crown at home and abroad increasingly falls on a startlingly small number of people, chiefly William and Kate, with much of the rest of the institution either aging, scandal-affected, or estranged. Constitutional scholars have pointed out that this isn't simply a personnel problem, it's a structural one. An institution that has spent decades successfully managing its public image, now facing a genuine bandwidth crisis, just as its reigning monarch's health adds yet another layer of unpredictability to long-term planning. There, also the deeper, more uncomfortable question running underneath all of this, one that surveys and public commentary have increasingly forced into the open, about what the monarchy is actually for in a country and a commonwealth that looks less and less like the one this institution was built to represent. Younger generations across Britain and across realms like Australia and Canada have shown measurably less attachment to the monarchy than their parents and grandparents did, support for the institution trending gradually downward even as individual royals, particularly William and Kate, retain considerable personal popularity. Charles's own reign was always going to be a test of whether personal charisma and goodwill could outpace that slower, generational erosion of institutional support, and the events of this particular year, an ailing king, a disgraced brother facing possible removal from the succession entirely, an estranged son fighting the government in court, have made that test considerably harder than anyone around him probably hoped it would be when he finally took the crown 3 years ago. Charles, diplomatic role has added its own layer of pressure this year at a moment when his physical stamina is already under scrutiny. Royal commentators noted his and Queen Camilla's recent visit to the United States, a carefully choreographed trip that included a meeting with President Trump, drew unusually close attention, not just for its substance, but for how the king appeared physically throughout, with some reports describing palace aides as visibly anxious about managing his energy levels across a demanding multi-day schedule of formal engagements. A king who might once have been expected to project robust vigor on the world stage, as a matter of course now has every public appearance quietly assessed by journalists and likely by his own staff for signs of how he's actually holding up, a dynamic that adds a layer of vulnerability to even the most routine diplomatic functions. It's a strange position for any head of state to be in, conducting the ordinary business of statecraft, while an entire industry of royal commentary treats each handshake and each moment of standing as data points in an ongoing semi-public health assessment. Comparisons to previous monarchs who reigned through serious illness have become something of a recurring theme in how commentators frame Charles's situation, even if the comparisons rarely hold up perfectly under scrutiny. George VI, Charles's own grandfather, continued performing his duties through declining health in the years following the Second World War. His lung cancer kept almost entirely secret from the public until his death in 1952, a level of medical secrecy that simply wouldn't be sustainable in today's media environment. George III, further back, became a kind of cautionary historical footnote after his declining mental health eventually forced his son to assume power as Prince Regent. Royal historians have been quick to point out that Charles's situation looks nothing like either of those precedents, given how openly his diagnosis and treatment have been discussed by the palace itself. But the underlying anxiety driving those comparisons is the same one that has shadowed monarchies for centuries. What happens to an institution built around a single, continuous figurehead when that figurehead's body starts to set the terms of how much the institution can actually function? Camilla, quote,'s own position has quietly become more significant as a result of all this, even though she rarely receives the same level of public scrutiny as William or Kate when royal commentators speculate about the future. As queen consort, she has taken on an increasingly visible supporting role specifically around Charles's health, frequently photographed accompanying him to medical appointments, standing closely by his side at events where his fatigue has been most noted, and occasionally stepping in for engagements when his schedule required trimming. She was granted the honorary title of Vice Admiral of the United Kingdom by the Royal Navy, becoming the first woman ever to hold that distinction. A largely ceremonial gesture, but one that reinforced her status as a fully integrated, trusted figure within the institution, rather than the more controversial outsider she was once treated as decades ago. Her steadiness throughout this period, by most accounts, has functioned as a kind of quiet ballast for Charles personally, even as the bigger institutional questions about succession and timing remain entirely outside her control to answer. Behind closed doors, the institution has reportedly continued its long-running informal practice of senior royals periodically gathering to discuss the shape and direction the monarchy should take as it modernizes, conversations that predate Charles's illness by years, but which have taken on obvious new urgency given recent events. These gatherings, sometimes referred to informally by royal watchers as conversations about the way ahead for the institution, aren't decision-making bodies with any formal constitutional standing, but they represent exactly the kind of long-horizon planning a hereditary institution has to engage in, precisely because it can't simply hold an election to settle questions about its own future. Reports describing William's expanding role, his new authority over royal warrants, his increasing presence at state functions traditionally reserved for the reigning monarch, are widely understood within royal circles to be downstream outcomes of exactly these kinds of conversations, formal commitments made quietly, well before any public announcement about how much weight the next generation should start carrying, and how soon. Public opinion polling adds yet another dimension to the pressure building around Charles's eventual transition, since the numbers themselves have become a kind of running referendum on how each individual crisis lands with ordinary people. The overwhelming public support for removing Andrew from the line of succession, with surveys showing the vast majority of British adults in favor, demonstrates just how little patience remains for protecting individual royals once their conduct crosses certain lines, a marked shift from earlier decades when the institution could often rely on a more deferential public mood to simply let scandals fade. That same shift in tone shapes how people respond to questions about the monarchy's cost and relevance more broadly, with younger respondents in particular showing measurably less attachment to the institution as a whole, even when they retain genuine personal affection for specific figures like William, Kate, or even Charles himself. The distinction matters enormously for long-term planning because an institution can survive individual unpopularity far more easily than it can survive a slow, generational drift towards simple indifference about whether it should exist at all. Money remains one of the most persistent undercurrents running through every one of these stories, even when it isn't the explicit subject of the headline. The sovereign grant, the public funding mechanism that supports the institution's official functions, gets renegotiated periodically against a backdrop of profits generated by the Crown estate, and any year featuring scandal, reduced royal output due to illness, or visible internal disarray tends to reignite familiar arguments in Parliament and in the press about whether taxpayers are getting reasonable value for that funding. Andrew's situation alone has generated fresh scrutiny of how much of his own historical income and housing arrangements were ultimately underwritten, directly or indirectly, by the wider family's private and public resources, questions that tend to resurface with renewed intensity anytime a member of the family becomes a source of embarrassment rather than goodwill. William's personal tax disclosures, by contrast, have been framed by royal commentators as a deliberate attempt to get ahead of exactly this kind of criticism, demonstrating transparency before critics have the chance to demand it, a noticeably different communications instinct than the institution typically displayed in earlier decades. The Andrew situation also carries a complicating family dimension that rarely gets the same attention as the headline-grabbing question of succession itself, namely, what happens to his two daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, who remain several places further down the line of succession in their own right. Constitutional experts have noted that any legislation removing Andrew from the succession would force lawmakers to make an explicit choice about whether his daughters should be removed as well, a decision with no clean precedent to draw on, and one that risks either appearing unfairly punitive toward two women who have largely stayed out of their father's controversies, or alternatively leaving an awkward, lingering connection to the scandal sitting quietly within the formal line of succession, regardless of what happens to their father personally. Whatever Parliament eventually decides, the process is expected to take years rather than months, winding through the kind of multi-stage legislative process and multi-nation Commonwealth coordination that makes even widely supported constitutional changes painfully slow to actually implement. That slowness itself says something important about the kind of future Charles is actually trying to manage. Unlike a corporate succession plan, where a board can simply vote in a new structure within a single fiscal quarter, the monarchy's transitions are constrained by centuries of accumulated legal procedure, by the need for agreement across more than a dozen separate Commonwealth governments, and by a deep institutional instinct toward caution that treats sudden change as inherently destabilizing. Every one of the open questions hanging over Charles right now his own health and the timing of any eventual transition, his brother's fate within the succession, his younger son's fractured relationship with the family, exists on its own separate, frustratingly slow timeline, none of which is fully within the king's personal control to accelerate or resolve, no matter how much energy he might have left to devote to any one of them. There, quote, S also, a quieter symbolic question, sitting underneath all of this, that historians of the monarchy have started raising more openly this year about what kind of coronation, what kind of formal beginning William himself might eventually receive whenever his own turn comes. Charles's own coronation in 2023 was already noticeably scaled back from his mother's, shorter, smaller, deliberately less lavish, in deference to a different economic and cultural moment. And many expect William's eventual ceremony, whenever it happens, to continue that same trajectory toward a more modest, more clearly cost-conscious version of the ancient ritual. That expectation itself reflects the same underlying tension running through every other story in this chapter of the monarchy's history. An institution trying to preserve enough of its ancient, almost mystical authority to still mean something, while simultaneously trimming every visible signal of excess that might widen the growing gap between itself and a public increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege. Whether that balancing act succeeds long after Charles himself is no longer the one performing it, is, in the end, the real question his reign is quietly being asked to answer, whether anyone in the palace is willing to say so out loud or not. None of which means the monarchy's future is somehow doomed, and it's worth resisting the kind of breathless crisis of the week framing institutions this old have weathered scandal, illness, and generational change before, repeatedly, and the British monarchy in particular has shown a remarkable, sometimes frustrating ability to simply outlast whatever crisis seems most urgent in any given news cycle. What's different about this specific moment is the sheer concentration of major open questions landing all at once on a king whose own physical capacity to manage them is itself uncertain, at a moment when his heir is being deliberately, visibly prepared to take on more responsibility sooner rather than later. Whether that preparation reflects calm, sensible institutional planning or quiet acknowledgement that time may be shorter than anyone wants to say out loud in public is, fittingly, exactly the kind of question this family has spent generations learning never to answer directly. For now, the king remains on the throne, the rumors remain rumors, and the rest of us are left, as we so often are, with this particular institution, watching the public performance closely while knowing the real answers are being worked out somewhere behind a closed door we'll probably never get to see.